Today I'm going to tell you a story. It is my life story, at least a segment of my story. It's about a journey that I have taken that has had a lot of years involved with my health. You know, you never ever treasure something until you lose it sometimes. And that's the way it is with health with so many people. So many people do not appreciate what they have until it's gone. And my health was that way. I felt like I was strong. I had more endurance than most people. I had a job with a business, and I had employees, and we were doing a lot of construction type projects. I would sometimes almost live on the job if it was too far to come home very easily. There were times when I would just drop where I was on a floor in a building, and I would just sleep there for a few hours, get back up, go to work, walk across the parking lot to a gas station delicatessen, get some junk food, get some pop, get back on the job again after I had nourished my body with this garbage. And I just went on like that endlessly and endlessly. And I just really felt like I had the world by the tail and I was going to get somewhere with it. And that went on for a number of years. I began to approach my 30s, and I slowed down slightly, but not a whole lot. But I just really was enjoying life to the fullest. It seems like success was coming my way physically, financially. I was going to be secure. My business was doing well. I just built a new house. I had a boat in my yard and a car in the garage and a truck in my new shop. And I just thought, for a young kid, I really had things going for me. One day, a bunch of our friends, it was kind of a fall day. It was really nice and warm and beautiful. It was sunny, but the rays were getting a little bit on the short side. And we'd all gone out to a lake in Wisconsin called Echo Lake. We were water skiing and fishing. It was a lot of fun. I love to water ski and fish, but I like to water ski more than I like to fish. So I was the guy who was skiing around on the lake while the other guys were trying to fish. And if I would go past their little boat, I thought they looked a little dry, so I'd throw up a rooster tail of water into their boat and upset them slightly. But I was having fun. Somewhere near the end of the afternoon, I started not feeling too well. I started feeling really just strange. A sensation came over my entire body that I just couldn't put my finger on what it was, but I knew I didn't feel good. And I began to really be concerned. Maybe I'm coming down with some sort of a bug or something. I don't know, but I just felt really, really strange, and I felt really uneasy. And I remember a thought came over my mind: you will never feel good again as long as you live. And, it just made me shudder. It's like, why on earth would you think something like that? Just because you've been feeling kind of nasty for about a half hour. But I remember that feeling, and it just didn't want to go away. And I went home, and I thought, it's just kind of a flu bug coming on. I'll take a couple of days off of work, and I'll lay around, and it'll get better. And every day, I just felt more and more strange, and I started to begin to feel worse. My wife and my family and I, we had a project that we were going to go visit some people in another state. We were going to drive halfway across the country, and I'm not feeling too good. But yet we got in the car and we began to drive, and I just started feeling inexplicable anxiety over what was wrong with me. And I began to feel like maybe I had some sort of neurological thing going wrong with me. I began to get a little bit dizzy, and my vision began to get blurred. And as time went on, I began to feel like I had, millions and billions of tiny little ants crawling around inside of my system, and I just could not put my finger on what's wrong. And finally, I told my wife we had checked into a hotel, and she put the girls to bed, and I said, I feel so incredibly awful. I think I'm going to go find a hospital and go to the ER. And she looked at me, and she's like, "This is serious, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, I don't know what it is." So I went to the local hospital there, and I checked into the emergency room, and the The people took down all my information. They put me in this little bay where there's wires, and there's these sheet type things, dividers that kind of roll on little rollers, and you're sitting on a little table there, and they had me get into this little crazy gown, which I don't know why you have to have me in a little gown with the backside exposed to the air, but I'm in there with my shoes off and the little gown, and I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. It's like 45 minutes, and finally somebody comes by, obviously probably an intern. He begins to check me out, asking me all kinds of questions, and I guess the answers that I gave him threw him for a loop. He did not know what to make of me, and I could see his eyes became very bewildered, and he kind of thanked me for my time and walked out and pulled the curtain in behind him, and he goes out, and I could hear him begin to consult with some other medical professionals there in the emergency room, and I could hear them talking, whispering in low tones, but my ears perked pretty well back then, and I could pick up sounds from quite a ways away, and I began to listen to them. Those sheets aren't all that soundproof, and I began to hear them say, well, what do you think it is? I don't know what it is. Never heard of such a thing. That's really bizarre. I mean, where did this guy come from? Did he say where he came from? All of these questions are going on. And finally they said, well, we got to do something. What are we going to do? We'll give him a shot. A shot of what? Well, I don't know, but we better give him something. I mean, the guy came in here, he's paid his money. He's going to be disappointed if we don't do some sort of a treatment for him. About that time, the gown was off, the pants and the shirt were on, the shoes were on, and I was running for the door. I decided that I needed to escape from whatever kind of confusion these guys had, because if they were going to give me a shot of who knows what, I didn't want it, and so I left. I fled, and I remember meeting one of them on the way out to the parking lot, and he looked at me, and I could see written on his face, yeah, that's probably the best thing you could do. He did not try to stop me. He just kind of looked at me with this funny little expression on his face. And I got back in the car and went back to the hotel, and my wife said, well, what did they do for you? And I said, absolutely nothing. And I didn't know what to do. So we traveled on to our destination. I continued to feel awful, and we eventually met with the people we were meeting with. Things were over. We drove to her parents' home. We stayed there about 3 or 4 days. I continued to feel worse. I began to have issues where I began to feel like it was almost difficult to breathe, like my muscles were not moving like they should to help me breathe. And I began to notice that my vision began to be worse and worse. My eyes were blurry. I couldn't see complete field of vision, and things they just wouldn't focus. And after another few days of being there, I noticed my balance I was beginning to not be able to keep my equilibrium, my balance, and I began to get really concerned. What is this? And we heard of a hospital sanitarium lifestyle center combination that was in the southeastern part of the United States, so we were not that far away from it at the time. We drove over. We asked the people if they could help check me out, and they began to give me a number of different types of hydrotherapy that retrospectively was one of the best things they could have done, even though they had no idea what was wrong with me there either. Finally, I decided we had expended our resources. It had sort of seemed to plateau. I didn't seem to be dropping any further. I was just incredibly weak. I slept a lot. Vision, balance. I had numbness and tingling in my muscles. I just really felt incredibly worthless. So I said, I'm not getting any better. I'm not getting any worse. Why don't we just go home? So we got back in the car and we began to go home, and about halfway home, my kidneys stopped functioning, and I began to retain fluid, and I began to get a little bit more scared at that point. And we reached home, and it was a couple of days before they decided to work again, and I believe they began to work again as an answer to prayer. I sort of recovered. It took several months, actually, for this to seem to pass on. I did a lot of things. I began to change my diet. I got serious. When you've been warned and you don't take the warnings as seriously as you ought to, when something scary comes upon you, suddenly you face up and you begin to get more serious. And I guess it's just the child in each one of us. You know, you decide to be a good boy after mom catches you doing something wrong, and you suddenly reform. Well, I felt like I'd been caught doing something wrong, and I was reforming. And so I began to be very careful of what I ate and how much sleep I got and all these things. But yet, the damage that something had done in my body was so severe that I just could not seem to really recover. I began to study, I began to read, I began to do research, I contacted various medical people. I did everything I could do to try and find out what was wrong with me. Eventually, the diagnosis that I was given was that I had chronic fatigue syndrome, although it didn't really seem to match up to how I felt. That was the closest thing that people would give me. I went to one infectious disease specialist. She examined me. She said, it's obvious you have some sort of a viral thing going on here. And so she took my history, and when I mentioned that I had stopped consuming dairy products in an effort to try and help my condition improve, she just immediately jumped on that, and she said, that's your problem. The reason you are sick is because you're not consuming enough dairy products. And I'm like, you're charging me $195 for 15 minutes to tell me I'm sick because I'm not consuming dairy products? Oh my, I don't think so. And so I began to look farther and farther and wider in every journal, every book, anything I could find. We didn't have the internet back in those days. It hadn't even been thought of. And so it was difficult to get information my way as fast as I would like to have it. But, you know, I began to pray, and I said, God, I need answers because I can't even support my family. One person suggested that I was suffering from clinical depression, and I said, well, I wasn't depressed until I was sick for a long time. I was quite happy until that whatever this is came upon me, and depression doesn't have all these symptoms. The long story short is this continued to remit and relapse and remit and relapse, and it became evident to everybody eventually that I was suffering from multiple sclerosis. I had heard of multiple sclerosis, or MS as most people call it. I'd heard about it all my life. I'd seen people with it. So I began to look at the prognosis for people with multiple sclerosis, and some had a good one and some had not such a good one. Well, none of them had a really good one, but some are worse than others. And it appeared that I didn't fit into the best category. And I got really scared. I really, truly wondered if I would survive long enough to raise my two girls who were like 8 and 10 years of age. I really seriously doubted I would live long enough to see them be able to be raised up into adulthood. And I was concerned how I couldn't work. I couldn't do anything. It got to the point where my wife would grab me by my belt or the seat of my pants and my shirt collar, and she'd pick me up to stabilize me, and she'd walk me around the house, or she'd walk me out in the yard over to the mailbox to get the mail and back in the house sometimes. I was so weak. Sometimes I could go on my own. Sometimes she'd have to help me along from one place to the other. And, talk about discouragement. Financially, it was terrible. We began to sell things. We closed a business. We liquidated all of the inventory. It didn't even quite cover, because of the economy at the time, didn't even quite cover what we owed. And so I had to deal with creditors. We sold our house. We sold our boat. We sold our tractors. We sold everything in the garage one by one just to stay alive financially. And I began to be really concerned what was going to happen with us. In the meantime, I'm still studying, and studying is a good thing to do because information is so valuable. If you need resources, information will help you find your resources. And I began to pray as well, and God began to little by little help me with information that had come across my path, and began to process the information. Eventually, it appeared that some of the things that I was doing, I might be doing right, and my strength began to slowly come back somewhat, but I just couldn't get up to where I felt like I was a real, viable human being again. And so I could work part-time intermittently, and we were struggling to survive financially on a part-time income. It just really didn't pay a whole lot. We had seen the point where we had lived in a really nice new custom home that we had just built, and now we were living in a very old single-wide mobile home. Instead of driving a very nice vehicle, we were driving an old $600 van. And, we just made it basically from week to week. Sometimes we had no clue how we were going to survive. But God was very, very sustaining through that time. And, even though it was worrisome, we never really went into a panic. We seemed to be able to hang on with our faith to God. I began to learn more and more about health, more and more and more. And up until that time, I'd not really even been interested in it. Until this time, I began to realize I needed to find more information. I actually needed to gain some education. And at that point, I became motivated to actually study into alternative medicine and to continue on as an educational process. And that was my motivation. But all along, I'm learning little pieces of the puzzle. And everybody wanted to know, okay, we're seeing the fact that you seem to have gained some ground. How did you do that? And I'd say, well, this is what I've learned. And so people began to ask me, every time they'd see me, what have you learned? What have you learned? What have you learned? And I began to learn little parts and, bits and pieces of all kinds of things about health, of course, in this ensuing program of study. And I began to find answers for other people as I was looking for mine. Incidentally, little gems would come up. And I began to share these things with other people. And little by little, God began to speak to me and make it real to me. He said, you need to start a health and healing ministry. I said, that's interesting. What would I call it? And I began to think about it, and I was looking through the Bible, and I ran across a passage in Revelation chapter 22 where it talked about leaves on the tree of life, and I thought, that's it, healing leaves. That's what I'm going to call my health information ministry, as I share health and healing with other people, because I get an opportunity to tell them about the tree of life. I get to tell them that there is a source for all the good things that comes our way. I continued to learn. I began to learn more and more things, and some of the things that I discovered that I want to share with you today, that I've shared with so many people all around the world, is that multiple sclerosis is just one of numerous autoimmune category diseases or disorders. If you look on websites, you'll find that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of autoimmune disorders. I thought I had heard of them all until I began to look on an official website where they were all categorized. It blew my mind how many there are. If you study back into history, autoimmune diseases are not that ancient. They're more a modern thing. We don't necessarily find those kinds of things that far back. In ancient times, God told the children of Israel when they left Egypt, He said, now if you'll live your lives the way I've asked you to and told you to and follow the precepts I had, I won't lay upon you the diseases of the Egyptians. I always thought, what are the diseases of the Egyptians? The Egyptians lived in Egypt a long, far away. Egypt is a long ways away. The Egyptians lived in an exotic place. Perhaps their diseases were exotic. Maybe there's some infectious plague that we've never heard of or whatever. And so I read some studies about it, and it discovered that the Egyptians loved a number of things that modern people love. They liked white bread. They were the first people to develop a grinding stone that could mill flour to make a white pastry-type flour. They could make white, fluffy bread. They enjoyed alcohol. They loved brewing beer. You can find in the excavations near the sites of the pyramids where they had all the slaves and everybody working. There were the big ovens, there were the mills, and there were the breweries. And history tells us the Egyptians loved nothing better than a nice glass of their beer, a couple of slices of their fine white bread with a thick slice of animal fat in between. And that was a great meal for them. And so as I began to see that, I thought, I wonder what kind of diseases the Egyptians actually had here. And sure enough, we find they've done some MRIs and things of some of the mummies, and they discovered that some of these pharaohs were suffering from degenerative diseases. Their arteries were occluded. They had degenerative arthritis and things of that nature, things that come from living on refined foods and foods that are lacking in sufficient nutrients. So we've got a number of different modern, so-called modern diseases that are going clear back into the ancient times, the times of the pharaohs, that God had said, I won't put those upon you if you'll live my precepts. And their precepts were to eat a very natural life and to work hard. Drink a lot of water, stay away from the fat, don't eat anything that had the blood in it, eat your fruits and your grains and your nuts and your vegetables. Those were the program that God gave them. And so I began to realize that they had this figured out a long time ago. I found that there was a physician in Oregon who had done a study in conjunction with the university, who his study had indicated that patients with multiple sclerosis, and he did this study, I believe it was more than 30 years, somewhere around 32, 33 years, that they kept the records and tracked these patients. And one thing that really gave me a lot of great hope was one of his patients was a lady who, when she followed his recommendation, she lived up into her 90s. I thought, that's awesome. Maybe this isn't such a death sentence after all. Maybe I have some hope for a better life here. But what he had discovered is that the less fat that multiple sclerosis or any autoimmune patient would consume, the less fat they consumed, the less symptoms they had, the slower the disease progressed, and the better the prognosis and the better the quality of life. And he said, particularly the animal fats were the ones that you had to be more careful of. He did allow some of the, perhaps sunflower oil, some flaxseed oil, a little bit of cold-pressed olive oil I saw in some of the literature that they found perhaps was even maybe healthy to a certain extent as long as you didn't consume large amounts. And so I thought, well, okay, so what is a low-fat diet? Average American is eating, perhaps 35 grams of fat a day or more. And so my program became very austere. I tried to keep it under 9 grams of fat a day if I possibly could. That's difficult if you're going to be eating out of things from the grocery store that have been touched by human hands before you got them. You look at the cans and the bags and the wrappers and the boxes and the side panels on boxes. You look at the fat, and I finally began to realize that I really can't eat anything that's already been processed before I get it. I have to eat things that I make it for myself at home. And so I began to use things, basically from the produce. I really couldn't eat the bread that came from the store. No more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for me. It just wasn't going to happen a whole lot anymore, maybe once in a great while. But if you ate one of those, it kind of meant you didn't get to eat anything else for the rest of the day other than celery or spinach or an apple or something because you couldn't take in any more fat. But I noticed that I had less problems. I began to discover that I felt somewhat better. I began to take and drink a lot of various vegetable juices. And I drank juice until I came to the point one day I just said I can't do it anymore. My wife began to change the juices. She said, okay, less carrots, more greens, less carrots. She'd go back and forth trying to find things that my system would stop rebelling at. But, after several years, it just got to the point where I think I just mentally had enough, although physically probably not quite enough yet. Sleeping was an interesting thing because, when you're sick like that, you need to sleep. I came to the point where I really couldn't sleep. I could lay down, but I couldn't sleep. And it was very, very difficult sometimes. And I discovered I was such a light sleeper that if there was any noise, I'd be back awake again. And then if somebody woke me up after I'd gone to sleep, I might be awake for hours. And so I really had an issue where I always was struggling to gain enough sleep. So many people were impressed with the fact that I was actually appearing to level out and not die from what the progression that it had. I'd had this incredible just nosedive for so long, and now it was leveling out and I was beginning to feel better. And not completely, but somewhat better. And I began to come to a point where I would remit and relapse, but the time periods were longer in between that I actually, before I would drop again. What I did notice, though, is that each time I would lose and then gain, the net loss there was always a small net loss. I never could get back what I lost. And that continued to concern me. About this time, I began to run into people who wanted me to come to their church or a camp meeting or something and tell my story, that here's this guy who's surviving and still being functional after he was at a point where he was basically non-functional. But it was so difficult for me because here I'm flying in an airplane and I get to where I'm going and I get off the airplane and man, that jet lag was terrible. Even if it was just across the country, it wiped me out. And so now it's going to be there. I get on a Friday evening, or on the next morning, or if it's a 3-day event, 2 or 3 days, I'm supposed to be speaking periodically. Maybe there's other speakers and I'm taking my rotation or whatever. By the time it got done and I got back on a plane to go home, I was totally wasted. I couldn't, my vision would be so blurry, I could not even read a magazine on the plane to go home. And when I got home, I would just get in bed and die. And that would last 2 or 3 days. I'd just kind of get my bearings back under me, my wheels back under me. I started rolling again, and I'm feeling a little better. And lo and behold, somebody needs me the next weekend. And so sometimes I had about 2 good days a week. And then I'm back on a plane again on Friday and I'm flying out somewhere. And it got to the point where I began to feel like I am just losing my life, and I had to slow it down. Plateaued for a while, and then I began to notice that, whereas the paresthesias that would cover my entire body began to recede and go away, and this time where I felt like maybe I was okay for a few months, then I began to notice one day I'm kind of dragging my leg a little bit. My right leg began to get a little weak, and I began to a little concerned. It seemed a little numb, and then I noticed that after several months it was like my right arm began to get numb, and I'm like, it's coming back. Something I've just not done enough of the right things. And I began to really struggle some more with that. And it began to get a little bit frightening because I'm right-handed. My right arm's always been the strong arm. And suddenly, and now, my left arm has double the strength of my right arm. And my right arm, it got to the point where I'd stick my hand in my pocket because it frustrated me so much that this arm's just kind of worthless. So I keep my right hand in my pocket, and I'm trying to figure out how am I going to become ambidextrous, because I'm not. Trying to, teach myself that I'm going to eat with my left hand. I can't write with my left hand. You can't read anything I write with my left hand, no matter how hard I try. And so I'm trying to type like this, and it just got to be really frustrating, and it was a little bit discouraging. Someone suggested to me one day, I heard of somebody one time who had a lot of amalgam fillings in their teeth. They got those fillings removed, and they seemed to improve some. Another person, they thought they had a lot of MS-type symptoms. They got the mercury out of their mouth. They seemed to feel better. I talked to somebody else. Well, they took it out and they got worse, or they took it out, it didn't do any good, and I was not really sure what to do. And so I contacted a friend who lived locally, who is a dentist, and I asked him what he could tell me about it. And he said, really, I can't tell you anything. I'm actually not allowed to talk to you about it. And that disturbed me. That actually kind of scared me. I began to continue to study, and finally one day I'm reading in an old book by an author that I believe was inspired by the Lord. And there was a statement in there regarding some of the old medications that were used back in the time of like Andrew Jackson and some of the, the old people in the early American days. One of the medications was called calomel, which is made from mercury. And I actually was reading a report where one of the presidents they felt like his physician perhaps inadvertently ended his life prematurely by treating him with sugar of lead and mercury, trying to cure whatever was wrong with him as he was languishing and suffering. And as I read these things, I thought, you know, when I was a boy, I used to play with mercury, and my father had a factory, and there were steam boilers and things, and you know, periodically the equipment would malfunction, and there would be a mercury switch somewhere that didn't function right anymore, and I would get to be the heir of that when they would replace it, and I would take it apart, and I would break it, and I'd let the mercury out, and I'd put pennies in it and turn them into what looked like dimes and try and fool people with them. And I was always touching this stuff, and people say, well, you know, I probably shouldn't play with it. It's probably not good for you, but nobody really told me this stuff was incredibly hazardous. And then I went to the dentist, and we had a local dentist who put an awful lot of fillings in my mouth, and I'm not particularly certain that I really needed all of them, but I got them nonetheless. I probably didn't take as good a care of my teeth as I could have or should have. I did eat a lot of stuff that I probably shouldn't have, and I had a lot of these fillings, and so I began to read and discovered that these amalgam fillings that we called silver fillings are actually a little bit more than 50% mercury and 50% and about a 49.5% silver. And so I began to read all the literature, and pretty much everything said, no, it's once they're joined or amalgamated together, the silver binds up the mercury doesn't get a chance to go anywhere, it becomes basically inert. Okay, that's what the experts are saying. They're the ones who will know. I'm fine with that. But yet I just kept kind of having this, I'm losing altitude in my life, and it really disturbed me, and I'm concerned. And I began to talk to more people, read more books. About this time, someone invented the internet. I began to find information very slowly because it was dial-up, and dial-up is so painfully slow that if I had to go back to dial-up today, I wouldn't even go to the internet. I couldn't do it. I'd lose my patience with it. But I began to learn and began to read, and people began to put things in my hands, and God was so good to give me the information paths that I had, that I began to discover that we have a lot of mercury in our environment in a lot of different sources. There is mercury in some of the cosmetics that women use. There are other metals in some of the cosmetics, some lipsticks and various things have it. A lot of the hair colors and hair tints have heavy metals in them. Tobacco smoke contains a lot of cadmium. Secondhand smoke has just as much cadmium as firsthand smoke. And I had smoked when I was younger, and so I began to think about, the possible toxic burden from the cadmium. You can sometimes get cadmium poisoning from various types of water supplies, depending on how the metals, whether it's concrete or sometimes they had galvanized things in there. You could get some heavy metal toxicity from that. And so I began to really look in my environment. And the more I read, the more I discovered that there are just myriads of sources. We even get mercury from the air. Coal-powered generating plants for electricity, we're recognizing that perhaps about 44 tons of mercury goes into the air in the United States every year. That's why we like to stop burning the coal and find cleaner sources of energy. I was a little discouraged when I found that many of the grains, when they're stored in the big bins and the big piles and things, there's a tendency for various types of mold and mildew and whatever to grow on those. And so in some places, and it's difficult to know who does and who doesn't, some of the places they actually begin to spray these things with retardants to prevent that on the grains, and some of these contain heavy metals. In one report that I read, some of the root vegetables sometimes in some locales are sprayed with anti-molding agents that can sometimes contain metal. So, I began to realize that there's a lot of sources out there where you can actually obtain a toxic metal poisoning from. I was fortunate to find a phone number for an organization in Minnesota that specialized in handing out information packages, and I began to read some of the information they sent me, and I discovered that one filling can leach up to 3 million mercury atoms into your system each day, and I had 13 of them, which caused me some distress. I had also traveled extensively when I was in college. I studied abroad. And 1/4 was required to have a whole bunch of vaccinations. And I remember being upset because when I got the vaccinations, it seemed I got sicker than I would have from the diseases that I was trying to avoid. And I don't deal with those vaccines anymore as I travel anymore. I personally don't think they're necessary for the places in the world that I go. So I have ceased to get those, but nevertheless, they were still in my system. And as I began to read, I discovered that the vaccines in those days, and some of them still today, contain a mercury solution called thimerosal. It's being slowly replaced with an aluminum type solution, which I'm not certain how much better that is for us as an adjuvant and as a preservative. But nevertheless, the fact that I had played with it, consumed it, kept it in my mouth, and harbored it in my mouth for so many years and been injected with it, I began to realize that perhaps I had a fairly heavy toxic metal burden. And so I decided that it would be a good idea to find out. Did I have it? Did I not have it? And so I was able to have a test run and discovered that I did indeed have a fairly significant level of several of the heavy metals, and I began to realize that, those things are not all that healthy in the human body, and I don't really want them in my body anymore. I found a environmentally friendly, metal-free dentist who was willing to carefully remove the metal that was in my mouth and replace it with metal or non-metallic composite fillings. The thing was that strange to me is I seemed to get worse. Every time I changed one, I got dramatically worse. And I began to get a little bit frightened. Well, I thought this was supposed to make me feel better, but what we discovered is that there's a proper way to remove this and a non-proper way to remove these things. And those of you, if you ever consider doing something like this, you need to do your research to make certain that whatever dentist you go to actually understands the right and the wrong ways of this. But I did it wrong, and it actually, I believe, set me back somewhat initially. But little bit by little, I began to find that there are good things in our environment that can help actually remove those things from us. Chlorella and cilantro are two of the things in the plant kingdom that are very beneficial at removing these. Vitamin C. Because of how severe it was, I actually went through some chelation therapy that I felt was, could be beneficial for me. But little by little, I began to work on removing it, not just from my mouth, but out of the fat cells and out of my brain cells as well. Because what we discovered is that these heavy metal atoms will transfer through the blood-brain barrier, and they will just contaminate and permeate all of your brain cells at once. I discovered, as I was doing some of my study, that the World Health Organization makes a statement that there is no safe level of mercury in a human body, that there is no safe level that does not kill cells and harm body processes. But yet, so many of us are carrying around it in our mouth. So if you look at all of the rules and regulations, the conclusion you can come to is that the government believes that the only safe place to store mercury is in a human's mouth. You're not allowed, when it comes to a dental clinic, it has to be treated one way. You're not allowed to run it down a drain. It has to be disposed of as a hazardous material, but it's safe in my mouth. Thankfully, we're beginning to see countries all around the world take a second look. A number of them in Northern Europe have outlawed and banned amalgam fillings completely. Others are beginning to de-emphasize it in their dental training programs. We're seeing rules and regulations in some of the states in the United States where you now have to inform the patient of the risks, whereas before it was assumed to be risk-free. But little by little, I think as a society, we're making some progress to where we become more in tune with the risks that we have. We're becoming little by little more responsible. More dentists, more physicians, more toxicologists are taking a second look and they're examining it. They're not just taking the official standpoint and the official statement, and they're beginning to do their own research, and more research is available. Florida's Environmental Regulatory Agency notes that the mercury filling from one tooth, if it were thrown in a lake, is enough to contaminate that lake to prevent it to be safe from fishing or swimming. But yet I had 13 of those in my mouth. It made it incredibly difficult, I believe, to have the health that I was hoping to have. In 1991, a PhD research toxicologist from the University of Kentucky in Lexington by the name of Boyd Haley began to discover some rather interesting evidence about mercury toxicity and autoimmune type diseases. And he says the basic research that I conducted shows the difference between normal and diseased tissue. He said, I concluded that there's clearly a leakage from a mercury amalgam filling. It's not just totally all bound up inert. He said that there's a strong probability that people who have such fillings in their teeth are being exposed to chronic low-dose mercury leakage. And according to Dr. Haley, he said having a mouthful of mercury from age 14 to 65 would greatly increase the risk of anyone susceptible to Alzheimer's disease. He did some testing, and he said, he said, by my examination of Alzheimer's infected cells, it told me that there had to be some sort of a toxic agent involved. And I'm talking about my struggle with MS, and I'm reading things about saying that it's even possibly connected with Alzheimer's. And I began to realize, no wonder that I tried for 6 months straight to learn one Bible verse and gave up. I could not learn one Bible verse. 6 months, I finally said, forget it. I'll never learn a Bible verse again. Thankfully, I can learn Bible verses today. I can remember those Bible verses. And when I do evangelism, the Holy Spirit brings them into my mind over and over and over again. And I am amazed at what God has done with my mind once I was able to get my system free of this. But he said, I did an experiment. I put mercury amalgam in a water. Then I placed a sample of brain tissue in that water, and I checked it over a period of time. And after a period of several weeks, I noticed that the exposure to mercury had suppressed the secretion from the brain tissue of tubulin, which is a major enzyme that performs critical functions in the brain. We have no idea what damage we're doing to ourselves through the things that we are doing to ourselves. And I can only tell you that I know from my own personal experience that I feel differently today than I did before that. One of the things that I noticed as I have been able to mentor and share information with a lot of people with autoimmune disorders through the years since my recovery, I have noticed that nearly all of those people also had the common denominator not only of the heavy toxic metals, but they also had the common denominator of a long-term viral illness. And many of them, not all of them, but a high percentage of them. And so I had to then focus my attention on building an immune system that could overcome this long-term low-grade viral illness and to recover from that. which means I needed to cut out the fat in my diet even more so than I had realized in the beginning. And I also needed to make certain I cut down the sugar. So here I was, okay, I'm getting to be very austere in my dietary program, no fat and no sugar. Now what am I going to eat? Fruit, grain, nuts, and vegetables. You know, there's basically back to the basics out of Genesis that God had given us to begin with. There's a Dr. Charles Williamson. He's a co-director of the Toxic Studies Institute in Boca Raton, Florida. A statement that he says, mercury toxicity also produces systemic effects from foul breath, ringing in the ears, to general fatigue and unexplained numbness and burning sensations that may be related. Most disturbingly, he points out, is the evidence linking mercury vapor exposure to the development of chronic kidney disease, autoimmune disorders such as lupus, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, scleroderma, ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and hypothyroidism. There is a ton of medical misery going on in the populations today because of the toxic things that are happening to us in our environment. We've got toxic metals in our air. We've got toxic metals in our water. You know, I live right next to a beautiful, clear, clean body of water, a beautiful river. I can go out in there in my boat and I can look down and I can see 20, 30 feet into the water, see something laying on the bottom. It's perfectly clear, but yet the Environmental Protection Agency says don't eat the fish in there. Don't eat more than one a week. If you're pregnant, don't eat any at all, basically. Why? Because of the pollution that's in that from heavy metals. So highly contaminated. Even if you go into the high altitude glacier lakes and find those beautiful little trout that seem to look so healthy in there, you can find some of these toxic elements in their tissue, clear up there in the places that people don't even get to go. They're not downstream. There's no runoff up there. That's how polluted our world has gotten. If I were to take anything away, if I were you and took anything away from this presentation today, it would be this. Get as close to the Garden of Eden as you can get here on this earth. Find a way to raise your own food. Raise as much of the produce and fruits and berries and things and vegetables as you possibly can on your own uncorrupted, unpolluted soil. Use organic methods to do so. If you do develop dental caries or cavities in your mouth, don't put mercury in your mouth. Use non-toxic or less toxic composite materials. Be careful what you let people inject into your body. Limit the amount of fat that you consume. Don't consume a lot of free sugars. The more sugar you eat, the more you paralyze your system. Be responsible for your own health. You don't take somebody else's word for it. Just because a doctor or a dentist or an association says something's good for you, do your own research. It's your body. Take the responsibility for your own health because no one else has the same vested interest in your health as you do. Little by little, I began to realize that by taking that responsibility for my own health, that I began to feel better. I began to recognize that through the course of time, that these cycles of remitting and relapsing were now beginning to get longer and longer. And I began to realize that when I lost something, I actually was gaining it back to the point where I noticed that after a couple of years, I actually said, you know, I think I'm actually getting stronger and I'm gaining back what I once lost. You can see, if you were ever to see a picture of me when I was, let's say, 18 or so years ago, versus what I look like today, it'd scare you to death. Say, wow, is that guy going to die on me before he gets out of my presence or not? That's how I felt. I look at those pictures and it scares me. I'm gaunt. My complexion is very sallow. I could go in the sun. I really couldn't even get a tan very much at all. And I didn't feel good. You could just see it in my eyes. I had the eyes of a dying person. And when I see it, it still gives me a little bit of the shivers up my spine. But how I feel today is so much different. Today, my vitality has returned. And, I'm spending a lot of my time talking with people who have the same thing that I had before and giving them, much further instructions and clues into how they can regain their health as well. One of the biggest problems that I find, though, in these people who are suffering from diseases today, once you've been sick for a long enough period of time, somehow, somewhere inside your mind, you lose the ability to even think of yourself any better than you are right now. And I remember that thinking, this is what I am. I'm never going to get any better. And I talk to people sometimes and they're like, yeah, this is what I am. I'm never going to get any better. And I'm like, but you can. I wish they could see the two people, the old me and the new me standing side by side. Yes, the old picture that I have has darker hair, and this one's got a whole lot more silver in it, but this body's got 10 times the battery charge the old one had. Whereas I used to struggle to travel, within the last 6 weeks, I have been all the way around the entire globe, doing presentations, taping TV programs, giving presentations to churches, to groups, to camp meetings. I have been all over this world doing the work that I do, sharing the gospel of Jesus soon coming with people. And man, I have got so much energy sometimes I don't know what to do with it. Yeah, I get tired. I'm not superhuman, but I do know that when I have regained my health, that we have a God who restores us abundantly. He restores us spiritually, emotionally, and physically. I was trying to give this little group of people in Asia out in the jungles one time some information about how they could live their lives better, and we were in this small little pavilion and a lot of primitive sort of people there. And I'm telling them, you need to drink more water. These soft drink refreshments you guys are getting from the little stores are not good for you. There's a bunch of sugar. Your teeth are rotting out. It's not building strong bones in your children. You guys want to eat the American diet, right? You want hamburgers and fries and hot dogs and stuff and potato chips. No, you need to eat the good stuff that you've got right here. You've got grains and vegetables and fruits in abundance. That's what you need to be eating. You need to go to bed at night. Now that you got some electricity in the village, you guys want to stay up and goof around all night long. You were way better off before. Go to bed. You need to drink plenty of water. And I began to share a lot of these principles with them. And I said, if you do that, you're going to feel like me. Because I feel like Superman. It was funny, I went back there several years later and I'm walking with this gentleman and we're going to visit somebody in their house that's sick. Some little child happens to see me through the tall grass between the homes there, and he looked and he said, "There goes Superman." I can't fly, and I suppose there's kryptonite somewhere in this world that would be my nemesis. But all I can tell you is I do love what God has done for me. I do believe that when he said, "I am come that they might have life and they might have it more abundantly," that he meant it in a spiritual sense and he meant it in a physical sense. It was never God's intention for us to be sick. It was never for his intention for us to suffer from disease. And I think that if we would have followed, all of us from the very beginnings of our lives, if we'd have followed the counsel of the best of our knowledge, that we would all feel better than we do today and have more health and more strength and more vitality than we do today. And maybe we don't, and that's some bad news, but the good news is that if we will return to the principles that God gave us in the Scriptures, and be as responsible as we possibly can, take advantage of the good things that he's given us, I believe that God is willing to restore everyone. God is willing to give all of us something better than what in the past we've chosen for ourselves. And God wants to do that for us, not physically, but also spiritually as well. We've made some bad choices, each and every one of us. The Bible says each of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but God is willing that none would perish, but that each one of us could choose and accept the gift of eternal life. You look at the story of the prodigal son. Does God stand out there with a club? Does he have a whip and say, yeah, come back and take your whip and then I'll let you in the house? No, he meets him at the end of the driveway with a robe, doesn't he? And that's what God wants to do for us physically and spiritually. He wants to restore us and lift us up and make us who he created us to be. And I encourage each one of you to know that with God all things are possible. All things are possible with God. And take hope in the fact that he is your Savior.